I'm excited to announce the History's Influence Patreon. Link is in the description. Welcome to History's Influence. One of the most important empires in history would be the Roman Empire, without question. What started as a tiny city-state in the centre of Italy became one of the most influential empires to ever exist, establishing the cultural, linguistic, technological, and religious foundations of Europe, and to a lesser extent, the entire world. Rome's incredible dominance and legacy were never certain, however. The ancient Phoenicians, known as Punics to the Romans, were a seafaring people from modern Lebanon who established many colonies along the Mediterranean. The Phoenician colony of Carthage in modern Tunisia eventually became a powerful independent state of its own. The Punic Wars, which pitted an early upstart Republic of Rome against the Republic of Carthage, saw an existential battle between civilizations, deciding who would be the predominant power of the Western Mediterranean. The Romans emerged victorious, destroying the city of Carthage in the Third Punic War and becoming the sole power in the region, setting them on their path to becoming an empire. But what if Rome had been defeated by the Carthaginians, relegated to the dustbin of history? How would Carthage fare into its future? How would the Mediterranean world change? Would Europe and the world be forever changed as well? All these questions and more will be answered in this alternate history. I decided against choosing the First Punic War as the point of departure. During this war, the Carthaginians held naval supremacy over the seas and had large mercenary armies on land. It would have been an easier victory than in the Second Punic War. However, I don't believe they would have felt the incentive to crush Rome afterwards. It's likely Rome would have just continued to expand into Italy and simply beat the Carthaginians at a later date. In order to prevent the destruction of Carthage, we're going to have a Carthaginian victory in the Second Punic War. In this war they were led by Hannibal Barca, who was a powerful statesman who benefited from his father's conquest and colonization of Spain. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, was a veteran of the First Punic War, and both he and his son were sworn enemies of Rome as a result. The power base of Spain, which included silver mines and the like, were used by Hannibal to initiate the Second Punic War. With the large army including war elephants, Hannibal crossed the Alps to Italy, losing half of his army and most of his elephants as a result. However, he did not have the army, resources, or siege equipment needed to make an attack on the city of Rome itself. Hannibal was a tactical genius who pursued a very successful guerrilla campaign within Italy, attempting to ally with local Italian tribes in order to have them defect from the Romans. The Roman army was able to continue rebuilding, however, after these massive defeats, such as in the Battle of Cannae, preventing Hannibal's tactics from having any long-term strategic consequences, despite defections from South Italian tribes. Hannibal was refused additional resources by the Punic Senate. This was primarily due to the anti-war faction, led by Hanno the Great. Hanno instead wished to focus on defending Carthaginian territory. His faction opposed the Barca family's faction, the Barcids. In this new timeline, we will assume that Hanno acquiesces to Hannibal's requests for a reinforcement after the Battle of Cannae. This would provide Hannibal with enough resources to successfully siege the city of Rome. However, I don't believe Carthage winning the Second Punic War would have been a cakewalk. Hannibal started the war himself. The anti-war faction was pressured into playing along, due to the power of the Barcid faction at the time. In our timeline, Carthage sent reinforcements of about 4,000 cavalrymen to Hannibal. A larger army was planned to be transported, but was instead sent to Spain after a major defeat in the region. I believe if Hannibal began a siege of Rome before reinforcements had arrived, even though he would have a lack of resources, the Senate would therefore feel more obliged to send reinforcements to him, despite the loss in Spain. We will assume this is the case. Hannibal is certainly one of the greatest generals of all time, so I believe a successful siege would be reasonable. The Roman general Scipio had later defeated Hannibal using effective counters to the strategies Hannibal employed at Cannae. However, Scipio had years to study the Battle of Cannae and to develop new strategies from it. He simply isn't going to have the opportunity in this new timeline. It's likely this successful siege wouldn't lead to the complete destruction of Rome, however. Considering the overstretched nature of Carthage at the time, it couldn't bring its total might to destroy the city at this point. The Romans would be forced to sue for peace, however. They would lose a substantial amount of territory. The islands of Corsica, Sardinia, and even Sicily will be returned to Carthaginian hands. The Romans would lose much of their territory, mainly being confined to central Italy at this point. We will see southern Italy fall under the influence of Carthage. The Romans would be forced to pay war reparations to Carthage, as Carthage had done to Rome during the First Punic War. In fact, one of the reasons the Barcas invaded Spain was actually to pay back these war reparations to Rome. It's important to note the efficiency of the Roman state, particularly in its military structure, which was crucial in Rome's victory against the Carthaginians in our own timeline. They used a system of mass conscription and standardized training. This conscription system allowed for the Romans to bounce back from their defeat at Cannae. Military generals were often rotated around and weren't required to be as skilled as, say, in the Carthaginian army. This is because the troops were simply better trained and weren't reliant on payment like mercenaries who Carthage relied upon. The consistent rotation of generals allowed for Scipio to arise as well, meaning skillful generals did have opportunities to flex their muscles too. However, this military machine would not make up for the greatly reduced Roman state. The Romans would simply be too weak at this point and wouldn't have the time to develop enough of a power base to compete with the Carthaginians. The Roman navy would no longer dominate the seas, with the Romans holding less territory and resources needed to maintain the navy. So, Carthage would once again dominate the Western Mediterranean. The anti-war faction of Carthage would lose its legitimacy with Hannibal's victory. Hannibal would now be seen as a hero of Carthage and hold a dominant role in its politics. The Carthaginians, as a reinvigorated superpower, would eventually fight the Romans again and conquer their rival. The city of Rome will become a territory of the Carthaginians, and the Roman Republic would be permanently destroyed. But wouldn't the city of Rome be destroyed like Carthage was in our timeline? It's certainly possible, but I don't believe so. The Republic of Carthage was first and foremost a mercantilist empire focused on prosperity through trade monopolies and naval dominance, not absolute destruction and acquisition of territories. The city of Rome itself would be a great city to hold in pursuing economic dominance in Italy. This makes sense given its central location and connection to pre-existing Roman trade networks. Let's now discuss the structure of the Carthaginian army and if it would allow for further expansion in this new timeline. The Punic armies were a polyglot collection of different ethnic components, with many mercenaries. There was no standard language to issue commands, quite a far cry from the uniformity and levy-based system of the Romans. Hannibal was able to use the strengths of the different specialized groups to great effect, such as flanking with the Numidian cavalry. With the Roman Empire destroyed, in its infancy, the Carthaginians won't be required to mount a strong defense against an existential threat. But I do believe they will adopt a degree of standardization in their army, relying less on mercenaries and more on conscription, as their empire would grow larger. Whilst they would maintain a mercantilist tilt, the nation would hold more empire-like characteristics. Historically, the anti-war faction wished to expand in North Africa, whereas the Bastard faction wished to expand further in Spain. I believe an Italian focus will predominate initially, due to the potential threat of the Romans. We will later see conquests in Spain and North Africa continue, solidifying Carthaginian control of these regions. The Numidians of North Africa may cause issues initially, but I think they'd be subjugated eventually. They simply weren't as strong as the Carthaginians. The western portion of North Africa would therefore assimilate into Punic culture, with the region staying a prosperous breadbasket. On the other hand, Spain's future wouldn't be so straightforward. To keep Spain loyal during the Second Punic War, Hannibal had demanded hostages from native tribes to be held in his captivity. This extractive and fearful form of colonialism will continue to predominate in Spain. But its effectiveness can't be denied. Roman colonization in the region simply inherited the successful efforts of the Punics, and Spain is very Romanized today, given their language and culture. We will assume therefore that the Carthaginians still assimilate the region, this time into the Punic language and culture. Southern and central Italy will fall under Carthaginian control, as previously mentioned. They will gradually push their control of Italy to the Alps for a better geographic defense of the region, being able to outcompete with the fractured tribes who were previously subjugated by Rome. They won't culturally assimilate Italy, however, given that the Latinization process that was already underway in the region. Although we're going to see Corsica and Sardinia assimilate into Carthaginian culture. Around the time of the First Punic War, Greek was the main language of trade in the Western Mediterranean. In our timeline, Hannibal was quite fond of Greek culture, apparently being able to recite Greek tragedies from memory, and using said cultural understanding to curry favour with the Greek-speaking allies in southern Italy. Latin came to dominate the region instead, however, and we're going to see the same process happen with Punic in this new timeline. I don't believe Carthage would conquer much land in other regions, however, such as in Gaul, which is modern France, or land in the eastern Mediterranean. The southern coast of Gaul would be colonised, however, or perhaps the Greek colonies in the region already would just be seized. This is because the Carthaginian army was not structured like the effective, self-perpetuating Roman army, and their political system did not encourage grand conquests without an existential threat. Even with the empire-like shift I mentioned before, I don't believe it would change their system drastically enough to replicate Rome's success. Without the threat of Rome, the Carthaginians would continue building power in the regions we've already mentioned. The Carthaginians would also be able to survive for centuries without a clear opposition in the region. This isolation would prolong the existence of their republican form of government. The Roman Republic's fall was made inevitable partially due to the mere size of their territorial holdings. To govern such vast territories from Gaul to Egypt demanded a centralized authority. But the structure of Carthage's government leads towards a less aggressive foreign policy. The Republic of Carthage was an oligarchy of wealthy men, which in this sense was similar to the Roman government. The Sophites, who were in essence judges, were at the top of the hierarchy, followed by the Senate, which mainly consisted of influential merchants. Collective decisions were made using both groups. These interest groups are going to be more focused upon prosperity and trade rather than in conquering the world. However, we can't forget the Bastard family, who under Hamilcar conquered a large amount of Spain, similar to Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, and I think we all know how Julius Caesar turned out in terms of his political leanings. The Barca family would have uncontested political influence after beating Rome, so Hamilcar's son Hannibal may choose to become a Caesar-like figure. I believe accounting for both sides of the argument, we would see an internal division in Carthage. Areas such as Spain and Italy would fixate on a direct monarchical relationship with the Barca family, whereas North Africa would maintain its republican traditions more closely in administration. Eventually, this tension would metastasize into civil conflict, likely with a monarchical victory. But I don't believe this new monarchical form of government would be able to make such large conquests like the Romans did, given the strong foundations of the merchant republic that would still exist. Rome was an empire before it had emperors, but I don't think Carthage will be. Moving our focus up north, we will see Gaul remain under indigenous control. The Gauls were a Celtic group, who were later Romanized, then occupied by the Germanic Franks. These specific stages of evolution created the fascinating specimens we know as the French. The Gauls were a relatively advanced people from the time, despite maintaining a tribal societal structure. This was due to their location near the Mediterranean world. In this new timeline, they will independently develop a more advanced form of civilization, with help from the Punics in regards to influence, rather than a direct conquest from the Romans occurring. In our timeline, the Gauls had attempted to unite against the Romans, but failed to do so effectively. Without the pressure of major foreign invasion, Gaul will instead develop into small microstates, which would eventually develop into larger states. The Germanic tribes to their east were tough foes, but wouldn't overrun the more advanced Franks. It's possible any Germanic threat may help unite Gaul, at least parts of it. After all, Caesar used Germanic incursions to justify invading Gaul for himself, to quote-unquote protect the Gauls. Without Roman occupation, Britain would instead receive technological advancements through the Gauls. The Anglo-Saxon migrations into Britain depended upon the weakness of the Britons, who after centuries of Roman rule were unable to defend themselves. So in this new timeline without the Romans, and some independent advancement thanks to the Gauls, I believe the Britons will be able to prevent such migrations happening in the same fashion. This would completely change English history, because English people would never exist. The effects on global history would be huge, and would probably be outside the scope of this video. The modern world simply wouldn't look the same, and this video wouldn't exist. Not just because of the altered timeline, but the language I'm speaking it in. Something important to mention though is that Australia would never exist, although some doubt it even exists in the first place. However, migrations such as Germanic ones were rampant during the period of the Romans, and their fall. To say the situation would remain static doesn't make sense historically speaking. Other groups will likely pick up the mantle, or perhaps the Germanics would invade in a different fashion or much later. Europe would not be the only area affected drastically. In particular, the Middle East would have massive changes occur. During the Punic Wars, the Middle East was dominated by Greek states, who were the successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great's empire. The Romans in the west and the Parthians in the east eventually usurped power in the region. However, Carthage won't be in the eastern Mediterranean like the Romans were. The Seleucids were the largest of the Greek states, with its territories going from modern Turkey, Syria, all the way to Pakistan. They were humiliated by Rome when trying to conquer mainland Greece, and this eventually led to their downfall. I believe without Roman interference, this invasion will be successful. However, I would still question the longevity of the Seleucids. I believe the Parthians will still come to dominate their eastern half. It's even possible they may invade into Syria and Turkey, unlike the Romans, who wouldn't exist. This would sort of create a new Persian empire in a sense. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt would remain a regional power, keeping the Seleucids in check. They had become an ineffective government by the time the Romans came, but I don't believe the overstretched Parthians will pull the same trick of invading them. However, the Middle East won't remain static, although it would be too difficult to predict the future of the region past this point. Except regarding a particular religion. Christianity is going to have its history changed drastically, without Roman control of Judea. Even assuming Jesus still preaches the religion from the region, without the interconnected empire of the Romans, Christianity is going to struggle to reach and dominate Europe, or perhaps even the Middle East. Maybe the Zoroastrian religion of the Persians and later Parthians would be adapted. Although it wasn't much of a centralized religion in the way that Christianity was by this point. This tended to happen more during the Sassanid period, in which Zoroastrianism was sort of linked with an Iranian nationalism, or I guess proto-nationalism of the period. So perhaps another form of monotheism will come to predominate the region eventually. The pagan religions of Europe, primarily Indo-European religions such as the Greek, Roman or Celtic gods, would continue to flourish for a longer period as a result. Of course, the Punic religion would dominate Spain and North Africa. This religion happened to involve human sacrifice. So I suppose instead of the Spanish conquering the human sacrificing Aztecs, the Spanish would just be doing it themselves instead. Moving our focus back to Europe, The destruction of Rome would have huge ramifications for the progression of history. Without the Christian and Roman influences, the continent is going to follow a much different trajectory. I believe a key element to mention would be the slowdown of civilizational development. Without the Romans directly ruling areas such as Britain and France, they're going to take centuries longer to become technologically advanced regions. This is not to mention the large role the Catholic Church played in advancing the civilization of Europe. But Carthage's impact is instead likely to come from osmosis, aside from the clearly influenced regions of Iberia and to a lesser extent Italy. But perhaps the Phoenician alphabet would be used in Europe instead of the Latin alphabet. I don't see it being the Latin alphabet at all actually. A final tidbit to mention for the video would be colonization. It is rumoured that a Punic man named Hanno the Navigator sailed from Morocco all the way to West Africa, perhaps as far as Liberia. These claims may be exaggerated, however. If these stories are even somewhat true, we may see an early Carthaginian colonization of West Africa. This may be followed by an accidental discovery of Brazil, potentially leading to an early colonization of the Americas. This would have massive effects for the Old and New World, but the evidence is kind of shaky in the first place. Also, this timeline is getting too unpredictable by this point, so I'm going to leave it here. This has been History's Influence. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Catch you later.